Hi, fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, a fantasy writer's kit bag. I'm fantasy writer Neil Mack, the author of Moondog and the Reed Leopard, and I want to share my love of folklore, local history and nature mythology with writers and creatives like you on my regular podcasts. It's designed with fellow indie publishers and writers in mind, but all fans of fantasy fiction are very welcome to join in. In my fantasy writer's kit bag, writers, artists and creatives will find lots of ideas and discussion about things such as potions, dark arts, fabulous creatures, folktale studies, nature lore, and the interesting history behind the myth and magic that underpins our understanding of the fictional universe. Hello, fantasy fiction fans. This week I want to discuss a fantasy writer's definition, the definition of elemental. Elemental. Now, according to the Swiss-born father of toxicology, so there's a word you've probably heard over the last few months, it's a bloke who lived in the 16th century. He's a medical man, a scientist, an alchemist, and a philosopher, a man named Paracelsus. According to Paracelsus, there are 4 categories of elemental, so I'll go through them with you. There are gnomes, and this word comes from the Latin genomos, Genomos, which means earth dweller. There are the undines or undines. This comes from the Latin word unda, meaning wave. And these are female beings that normally are associated with pools and waterfalls. This would include mermaids. Then there are sylphs, and this comes from the Latin word sylvestris, which means wood or woodland or woodland grove, and it's blended with the other Latin word nympha, N-Y-M-P-H-A, which means bride, to create a new portmanteau word. And these are described as mythological air spirits. And so all fairies of the air, if you picture Tinkerbell, she would be a sylph. And then there are salamanders, finally. And since ancient times, folk have believed that salamanders are the product of fire. And perhaps it's best to see salamanders as perceived by Paracelsus to be lizard-type creatures that are associated with fire. They're not the newt-like amphibians that we understand. But if you think of them as lizard-type creatures associated with fire, then this group would include dragons. And although the Renaissance medical man Paracelsus would have no understanding of what we understand about salamanders nowadays, he seemed to be onto something, because we now know that salamanders have unbelievable, almost miraculous regenerative capabilities. And the exceedingly strange and completely baffling walking fish, also known as axolotl, which is a type of salamander, is being studied at the moment in science, and it seems to be indestructible and it seems to be immortal. Anyway, by equating each of these supernatural creatures to a different class, in other words, to a different classical element. So the classical elements, which were known, of course, to the Indians, the ancient Indians, and the ancient Egyptians and the Greek scientists, which were earth, water, air, and fire, by attaching each one of the supernatural creatures to a classical element, Paracelsus cleverly brought the notion of supernatural entities into a scientific framework that could be easily understood. And I think this is very clever because it sort of rationalises supernature. We know now that there are over 100 chemical elements. And it's also worth remembering that the periodic table of elements that we are familiar with wasn't actually established as a science until 1789. And that was when the French chemist Antoine Lavoisier, who's known as the father of modern chemistry, he published a list of 33 chemical elements, and he grouped them into gases, metals, non-metals and earths. So he did use some of Paracelsus's ideas. And the first recognisable periodic table, also known as the Mendeleev table, was published in 1871, so quite recent. But anyway, back to elementals. It suggested that there was a notion of hybridization that might helpfully explain some types of co-evolution between elementals and between humans, because Paracelsus conjectured that human beings were composed of 3 essential ingredients, and I'll go through them with you. An elemental body, which I suppose is the fleshy and the corporeal part of us, a sidereal spirit, which is the astral part of us, the bit which is, I suppose, governed by the stars, so astrologically, and an immortal divine soul. And the elementals, the gnomes, the undines, the sylphs and the salamanders, they had no immortal soul. But if they married a human being, then that elemental and perhaps its offspring would also gain a soul. So that brings in this possibility of co-evolution, and it makes hybridization seem a little bit more understandable. You may have heard of Rosicrucians. Rosicrucianism is a religious movement that grew from the ancient wisdom that had been secretly kept, I suppose, by the mysterious brotherhoods of alchemists and the various different sages who worked in alchemy, and Paracelsus belonged to these. And Rosicrucians still adhere to the thinking behind the elementals. So that's what elemental means, and that's what elementals are. How would you know if somebody actually, literally, really, definitely saw a ghost? I kind of cover this a little bit in Moondog and the Reed Leopard. On set, apparitional experiences normally occur spontaneously and in rather prosaic and even mundane settings. They don't happen, for example, in haunted castles. They don't even happen at the seances that you'd expect. And they often occur under conditions of low arousal. And they most often, in actual fact, occur in the subject's own home, and often whilst completing routine tasks. So, if a person tells you that they saw a ghost the other night while they were doing the hoovering, that's less likely to be fabricated than a subject who said that he went to a haunted place, a haunted castle, to see a ghost, and yes, he saw one there. On-set apparitional experiences occur spontaneously, and they occur in prosaic settings. The second way you can tell is this. Apparitional phantasms tend to be reported as appearing solid and not transparent. All this stuff about walking through walls or being see-through doesn't seem to be true when you're talking about a real apparitional experience. Indeed, so realistic are the phantasms that often the percipient is unaware of their hallucinatory or apparitional nature. Often the percipient tries to have a dialogue with them. And it's not often until later, when the percipient thinks about it, that he or she realises that the experience was in fact apparitional. So if a person tells you that they saw a ghost floating along and then fading through a wall, it's less likely to be true than if somebody said, I was talking to this person for at least 10 minutes and this person was nodding to me and they were smiling at me. Thirdly, it's unusual for a phantasm figure to be involved in any interaction with a perceiver, because most experience stories involve only one sense, and that's the visual sense. Although some later perceivers remember things like thermoreception, a perceived change in temperature, and sometimes they report a sense of smell that was affected. On the whole, it's a visual experience. So if a person says that they heard chains clinking, that's unlikely to be a true ghost report. And finally, apparitional phantasms tend not to be frightening. This one is the most important one, and this is the one which I find the most interesting. The experience is not scary. In actual fact, I'll even go as far as saying, when I've spoken to people who have had these experiences, that they found the apparitional experience to be soothing and even reassuring. There's a sense of calm and a sense of peace when you actually come face to face with a phantasm. So that's how to tell whether or not a witness has experienced a true ghost. Good luck, and make sure you remember those 4 ways when you're writing your fantasy. This week, my fabulous creature of the week is the wulver. Wulver as well, you could say. Wulver. A wulver is a type of humanoid wolf creature, kind of half man, half wolf, found in the folklore of the Shetland Islands in the British Isles off the coast of Scotland. The wulver has been described by locals as a tall human person with the head of a wolf. Dr. Susan Shun Eberly, who has studied folklore traditions on the Wild Isles, suggested that the local people are probably citing an example of a person, or perhaps several persons over time, suffering from Hunter syndrome. Hunter. Hunter syndrome causes abnormalities in many organs. Physical symptoms don't manifest themselves in early childhood, but as a person gets older, then they start to gradually exhibit some of the indicators of the syndrome that might include, for example, distinctive coarseness of the facial features, a prominent large forehead, a nose with a flattened bridge, and an over-enlarged tongue. They might also, in extreme circumstances, exhibit an enlarged head as well as an expanded abdomen. Now, it's a very rare disease, with perhaps only 2,000 people afflicted by the syndrome at any one time in the world, and approximately about 500 of those syndrome sufferers live in the USA. Now, does this explain the tale of the Beast of Bray Road? I don't know if you've ever heard of it. But in 1936, near Elkhorn in Wisconsin, a creature was reported on a rural road that was said to be like a bear-like creature, but a biped. It stood on 2 legs and it resembled Bigfoot. And it was unusually large as well. It was said to be about 7 foot tall when it was stood on its hind legs. And it seemed to be intelligent, like a large werewolf character. But unlike a werewolf which was on its 4 legs most of the time, this could walk on its hind legs. Now, mass hysteria probably accounts for some of the reported sightings of the Beast of Bray Road, but several witnesses saw the beast in around the Bray Road area. And you've got to remember, this is a long way from the Pacific Northwest, which is Bigfoot territory. And anyway, this beast was described as being wolf-like rather than an ape-like creature. So it was more closely related to the wulver that I started with, the wulver of the Shetland Islands. But the wulver is a type of humanoid creature, half man, half wolf.